Hey guys, welcome back to 1776 or Bust. First things first, please give us a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. Also, make sure you hit those notifications so you get notified that these amazing videos are coming to you. Also, if you don't mind, take a look at that Teespring store, 1776 or Bust Superstore, and you can buy some pretty cool merchandise that does help the channel. Appreciate it, guys. Now, let's move along. Let's talk about two fantastic firearms, the CZ P07, the CZ P01. Both of these are the Omega versions. Again, keep in mind, the P07 had an original version. It was called the Duty. Apparently people laugh when I say that word. So, you know, it's Duty, but it was a pretty cool gun. Had some issues with the polymer separating, but other than that, I owned one. It was fantastic, very reliable. The finish wasn't so great. So it's kind of the early, I guess you could say, movement towards a P07. They then came out with this line, the Omega version. So I guess you consider it Gen 2. It's a reinforced polymer, fantastic handgun. There's a lot of people who love these guns. I know Honest Outlaw calls this his favorite handgun to carry. And I agree with him. It is really just an amazing firearm, super reliable, pretty easy to shoot. And really, there's not a lot of complaints about the firearm overall. The CZ P01, again, is kind of that classic CZ75 look. This one is the alloyed lower with the steel slide. So it does make for a little bit more weight than, let's say, a polymer firearm. But again, it is that classic CZ75 feel, which just makes it ergonomically just amazing. And again, very good shooter, very reliable. At least mine have been. There have been some complaints about the Omegas with the cocker and the safety potentially walking out. I've never seen that on this one in particular, but I do have two others that are the non-Omega versions. And those are actually my preferences. I like the hook trigger as opposed to the semi-flat trigger that you see on the Omegas. But what this video is really about is to talk about what are the real similarities between the two guns. Now, I can make a video with a laundry list of things that are dissimilar between the two. But interestingly enough, after kind of playing around with the guns for a little bit the other day, I started to realize more and more that there's a lot more similarities than differences. And a lot of it actually has to do with the size and the shape of the firearm. So we're going to take this table. I'm going to show you specifically what I'm talking about. And at the end of the video, leave those comments down below. Again, I think the P07 probably has a wider following based on the price point. You know, at one point, the black versions of these, you could get these for $375, $400. These were about $550 and change, maybe a little bit higher. Now, because of all the craziness, these are going in the fives and these are going in the mid sixes. So it's kind of interesting how things tend to change, especially when there's a huge major issue in the country. But nonetheless, let's go to the table. Let's take a look at the similarities between these two guns. And at the end, let us know which one you would prefer and why. So let's go to the table.
All right. And we're at the table, everybody. So here on the table, you see two great firearms. You see the P01 Omega, the P07. This, again, is going to be your second generation P07 from the old P07 Duty. And this is your P01 Omega that has taken over for the regular P01s, although you can find them still. I actually own two of them. I own a green one and a black one. And I love this gun. This is probably my favorite. I shouldn't say probably. It definitely is. It is definitely one of my favorite handguns that I've ever owned. It is my favorite overall. So, you know, take that for what it's worth. Now, the P07 and the P01 are kind of interesting because they do look pretty different. When you look at both of these firearms, you're going to realize, man, there is a significant difference to the way they look. However, when you look at the similarities and you begin to look at the size difference, and basically you start to figure out, well, maybe they're not so different after all. And it's kind of interesting because I look at the P07 now as kind of the modernization of this. Now, keep in mind the CZ75 line has been around for forever. And this is basically a CZ75 just in a smaller compact version. And to me, the ergonomics are great, but I think eventually what CZ was trying to do is try to modernize their line, I guess. And so they went to the polymer. Now, keep in mind, the first polymer on this was not so good. Now these are reinforced. They're a glass reinforced polymer that they're using in these lowers. So it has really dealt with a lot of the issues that the splitting and the separation had in this area of the actual handgun on the old ones. The finish has also been vastly improved, so you don't have to worry about that as well. But when you look at both guns, aesthetically looking, you're going to say, yeah, there's a huge difference in the way they look. However, when you start to look at all of the I guess you could say the metrics behind the gun, in other words, how the gun sizes up, you're going to realize that these guns are actually more similar than they are different. For example, if you have an empty mag or with no mag in either one of these, the Omega is 25.2 ounces and the P07 is 25.2 ounces as well. So the weight is exactly the same. And I'm cheating, by the way. Oh, and by the way, thanks to Harry's Holsters, because this is the cheat sheet I'm using. So the weight empty with the magazine inserted into the gun is 28.2 ounces for the P01 and 28.1 ounces for the P07. So really negligible in regards to weight. I don't consider that, that significant of a weight difference. The overall weight with a full magazine, again, it's only separated by 0.1. So you've got 34.7 and 34.6, which is kind of interesting when you're dealing with an aluminum lower versus a polymer lower. You think that polymer would actually have a bigger advantage in weight, and actually it doesn't. So I thought that was kind of interesting. The height, which according to this says top of slide to the bottom of the magazine, so top of slide to the bottom. For your CZ P01 Omega, it is 5.1 inches from top to bottom. And for the P07, it is 4.9. So you're looking at a real major difference of, pretty much nothing. So you're looking at basically 0.2 of an inch, which is pretty good. I mean, is it going to be really anything? Honestly, it has nothing to do with the firearms. It actually has something to do with the base plate of the magazine. The base plate on the magazine, the P07, is a lot shorter than the base plate on the P01. So because of this, you're actually gaining that 0.2 of an inch in regards to height, which is kind of interesting. As a matter of fact, I popped both magazines out and I measured from the bottom of the magwell to the top of the slide on both of these, and they actually measured identically. There was no difference. So the only difference you're going to see is basically the base plate on the P01 versus the P07. So when we look at the length, overall length, you're looking at a P01 that has a 7.2, and then this is 7.25. So, that again is not that significant of a difference. And I think it really boils down to this beaver tail. The beaver tail is a little bit longer than it is on the P01. So to me, that's where you're going to find the most difference. Also keep in mind, this was a threaded barrel. It has been recrowned, so that's why it's sticking out. It really shouldn't look that way. It should be more recessed into the gun. Now, when we talk about the width of the grips, 1.4 for the P01 and 1.16. Now, keep in mind that P01 on these original grips, they're kind of that thick rubbery thing, so that absolutely will increase the width of the gun. However, these are lock grips. They're a lot thinner. I measured this one, and they were actually identical now because of these lock grips. So just keep that in mind, that's where that difference would probably come in with regards to the width. The slide width, again, 0.93 for the Omega, and then 1.06 for the actual slide in regards to the P07. And keep in mind where that width is coming from, guys. It has a lot to do with these serrations on the slide. So if you measure the serrations, these serrations are much thicker, whereas these are a little bit thinner and more recessed in. So you're going to see a little bit thicker on that slide. Now, if I hold both guns up to you like this, let's see. You think it's going to be much thicker because it definitely does look that way. But keep in mind the way they've designed these slides, the slide is actually, again, about the same. The only difference is that the P01 is a little bit more rounded on the slide, whereas the P07 is a little bit blockier, I guess, or squared off. So just keep that in mind as well. Last but not least, we look at the width across the controls. So your P01 is 1.5 inches across, and then this is 1.46. So what does that really mean? It just means that there's a little bit wider control here, which is kind of interesting. And where does that come into play? Well, again, if you look at it from top to bottom, you're going to notice that slide release and slide lock on the P01 is a little bit, I guess you could say, more pronounced on the sides, as well as the decocker or safety, depending on what you do. So when we look at the similarities between the two firearms, just in size, in weight, length, width, everything, what you're going to find is that there is no significant difference between the two. Now, some might say, well, there is still a significant difference if you choose to carry them because it is a little bit bulkier or whatever it might be. But I've carried both these handguns. I've found nothing different between the two in regards to size, weight, and how they carry. I mean, they both carry very well. They both, I have to say, they both shoot really well. Is there a little bit more of an advantage? Probably because the polymer flexes a little bit more than the aluminum, obviously, but both are pretty spot on. There's really no issues with that. Now, ergonomics, again, you can take the ergonomics and you say, well, which one feels ergonomically better? Interestingly enough, I would always say this. I think the CZ75 just really connects with the shooter a lot better because of the way this grip is molded to people's hands. Now, if you have really large hands, then the compacts won't necessarily work. But for those of you who have shot the larger full-size CZ75 lines, you're going to know that the ergonomics of this are great. Again, you can kind of see a similarity here between the P01 and the P07. Let me zoom in a little bit. Oop, there we go. So your P07 definitely has a little bit more of a squared feeling to it, a little bit flatter on the sides here where this is rounded. However, if you guys were to kind of superimpose one of these guns on top of the other, and let me do it the other way, because I think that would make more sense. You know, even though that P01 has a little bit more of that curvature in the grip, I'm trying to line these up without really looking at them closely, which is pretty hard to do when you're doing camera work here. But if you do notice both of these, and that's about even, what you're going to see here is you see that P01 kind of, that hump in the back is kind of just sticking out a little bit. Now, this is the medium backstrap on the P07. I only did that to see if I could get more of that ergonomic feel of the P01. And honestly, I can't. This will probably go back to the small because I just think the small feels a little bit better, but that's me. Now, obviously, this is a little bit flatter in the back. This is a little bit more rounded in the back. But other than that, the guns actually line up almost identically. So even though the P07 looks a little bit weird compared to, like, let's say a CZ75, one of the things you've got to realize is that ergonomically, this is pretty close to that P01. So yeah, I mean, it's really amazing when you start looking and breaking these guns down, how similar they really are. So obviously you can see a squared off trigger guard here, which is probably more of like a modern feature as opposed to this more rounded with the squared off edge here. But I mean, other than that, these guns are so similar to each other that you honestly can't necessarily say which one's better than the other. I think for those of you out there who have never experienced shooting a CZ, I think you should at least pick up one. And I'm not talking about the P10C. That's a whole different game. But I definitely think one of these hammer fired would serve you pretty well. And I think you'd enjoy shooting it. Now, if I was going to say what is the major difference between the two, or why is there one that's more popular than the other, obviously it's going to have to deal with material used and also price. So again, the P07 is a cheaper firearm, not cheap quality, just cheaper price. So I think that's why you see such a huge following on the P07 versus a P01. I think people obviously like the polymer. They feel it's a little bit more modern of an option. But I think at the end of the day, if you've never experienced shooting one of these, you should at least try. Overall, I think most people go with the P07 because it's ultra reliable. It is just a fantastically built handgun. And more importantly, it's going to be the price factor. I mean, the price of the P07, I'll be honest with you guys, is a hell of a lot cheaper than this. You know, in the good old days, you could probably find these online used for about $375. Brand new, you're talking about $450 max. And that's great for this type of firearm. In regards to P01, you were looking at probably around $550, $565, around there. Now these are going for about $100 to $150 more just because of the crazy times we're in. And this one in particular is about $550 now. So it's kind of interesting to see how the changes occurred with prices. So I'd love to hear what you have to say. What do you think are the similarities between these two firearms? If you had to choose, which one would you go with and why? And more importantly, do you own either one or both? So leave those comments down below. Thanks for watching, guys. I appreciate you sticking around. I hope you have a great night. Stay safe. And as always, freedom is never free.